Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm Chris. This is a little different. I'm freezing up, I see on the screen. There we go. Okay, we're good now. Alright, so this is a little different. This is American Battlefield Trust. And I like the channel. I've looked at some things before, but this video just dropped. And it's Where the Civil War Began. Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter. Sumter. I always say Sumter. S-U-M-P-T-E-R. Not a big deal, but it just, you know, I'm stupid. So, we're not going to say that we're not going to admit that, right? We'll just keep that between us. So, get your tea, and let's get into it. I'm going to take a drink. I feel a little bit under the weather, a little scratchy in the throat. Drink some tea, hopefully that'll cut that off. This will be 2 videos. So, in case you were wondering. Let's go! Nose itches.
Hi, I'm Chris.
Hey, Chris, how are you?
Oh, thanks for having us out here.
Okay, well, welcome. We'll be taking off, heading to Fort Sumter in just a few minutes. It'll take about half hour to get out there, so looking forward to showing you the fort. Wonderful.
So, Gary, as we go across the harbor, what are some of the things that we'll see?
Well, Chris, what you're going to see over here is the historic city of Charleston. It's built on a peninsula. It's bounded on the west side by the Ashley River and here on the east side by the Cooper River. Charleston was founded in 1670, but in a different site. The first founders sailed up the Ashley River and made a settlement on the west bank. But 10 years later, once they were confident that a settlement here could be viable, they actually moved over to the harbor front and settled in the present location in 1680. So what you're seeing right over here is the historic part of Charleston.
Now, Charleston to Fort Sumter, that seems like it's kind of a stretch.
It is. It's 3 miles from the, let's just say the tip of the peninsula, which is, we call it the Battery, out to Fort Sumter, which is near the harbor entrance.
Now, a lot of people think that the Confederates put cannon in the Battery and fired on the fort from there.
No, sir. Never happened. It's called out of range. The old smoothbore cannons of the day could fire the round cannonballs on the average of about 1.25 miles. So if you were going to set up cannons on the islands or thinking of hitting Fort Sumter, you would have to be on the islands around the fort, such as Sullivan's Island, Morris Island, and James Island. Now those locations you could actually...
I'm one of those people. I didn't realize it was 3 miles. Yeah, didn't realize it was 3 miles at all. Sorry, I'm just kind of eyeballing everything. This must be then where they fire. Okay. There's a lot of words and I wasn't really reading, so I apologize. Fort Johnson is right there. Fired first shot on Fort Sumter, starting the Civil War. Okay. Cummins Point batteries. Wow, so that's just a little island out there. Interesting. I've never been there. It is a place that I think would be... This is another reason why I'm doing this. I think it would be really cool to visit that place. But I've never... You always hear the firing on Fort Sumter, but I stuttered there in the... but I guess I've never looked at a picture as to, you know, how it looked. I didn't realize... It's a... Okay, sorry.
We hit Fort Sumter because you're within that 1.25 mile range, but nothing from the city, too far away.
Now, as I understand, there are some artillery pieces that are in the Battery downtown that were...
Let me change the quality. That's what it is. But if it keeps glitching out, I'm going to drop it down a little bit more. Sorry. Once I touch it, I can't There.
Used as part of the siege and at the fort.
They are.
They're not in position.
I kind of tell folks that if you go down to the battery and see the city's nice collection of cannons, it's just a park with cannons. It had nothing to do with the firing on Fort Sumter. However, the whole city front that you see here behind us was later well fortified after the Union Army captured the Buford Hilton Head area south of us in November of 1861. So at that point, the enemy's right down the road. So the already underway defenses of Charleston Harbor were escalated. And they had a whole row of artillery, anticipating that the Union Army would try to get into the harbor at one point, which they never did. There was only one naval battle here in the spring of 1863. It was out between Fort Sumter and Fort Moultrie. The U.S. Navy struck out, you might say, but none of their ships ever penetrated the harbor. But our artillery, defensive artillery, did remain along the city front for the remainder of the war.
Now, a lot of people kind of had that mistaken assumption that Fort Sumter and that was it. But there's actually a lot of military action that happens around Charleston over the course of the entire war.
Sure, exactly. In fact, when we reached the fort, the appearance of the fort itself in the state that it's in today is due to what happened later in the war, not April 1861. Charleston was under siege from Union artillery on Morris Island from the summer of 1863 to the beginning of 1865. So we're actually sailing through the most bombarded area in all of North America to this day.
Oh, wow.
It was a pretty long siege. The Confederates dug in. They're not going to give it up. And the Union Army, once they started, well, they have to see it through. So it kind of stalemated after a while, but the Union's gaining the upper hands by really tearing up the city and reducing Fort Sumter to rubble from hitting it repeatedly, sometimes up to 500 times a day. But that's new artillery. Remember that the old round cannonballs can only go 1.25 miles. By 1863, the Union has rifled artillery, and they're firing 100, 200, 300-pound bullet-shaped projectiles a distance of 5 miles.
Holy crap! Wow, regardless of whatever side, that is an advancement of technology. From firing a cannon smooth bore that 1.25 miles is impressive for a cannon. I'm sure the accuracy. Well, those people were the accuracy. If I'm shooting at you, you have a 107% chance of surviving because I'm sure I'm not going to do it right. But trained people a little different. But to go from a cannonball that fires 1.25 miles to smooth bore bullet looking things things. Well described, Kris. They can go up to 5 miles. That's amazing. So much. This is a terrible way to phrase it. So much technology of war advanced in the 4 years of the American Civil War that carried into trench warfare in World War I. And brutal. I'm just glad we didn't gas each other, like mustard gas and all that was used in World War I. Oh, that would have been terrible. I mean, it's terrible, period, but oh, wow.
Wow.
So that is the big innovation, really, in artillery during the Civil War is the coming online of widespread use of rifled artillery.
Now, I guess we're just passing a sandbar behind us. We're passing a structure out in the harbor that's got a flag. Castle Pinckney. What is Castle Pinckney?
Castle Pinckney was part of an earlier system of coastal fortifications in Charleston Harbor. We have Fort Moultrie, which is on Sullivan's Island, Castle Pinckney that we see right here, and then a brick gun tower at Fort Johnson. All of these were built in the 1809, 1810 time frames, right before the War of 1812. As we see the ruins of Castle Pinckney, it did not play any major part in the the Civil War here. The main reason it's too far up in the harbor. Most of the fighting is out there around Fort Sumter. So even if you had a cannon at Castle Pinckney, it's still, oh, holy cow, like over 2 miles to Fort Sumter. So you couldn't even hit Fort Sumter from Castle Pinckney. So it's kind of it is a historic structure, but did not play a big part in the Civil War. It was briefly used as a prison for Union soldiers in the first part of the Civil War. But after that, they were moved elsewhere.
Castle Pinckney gets its name from Charleston's Revolution era history.
The Pinckney family was a prominent family here in Charleston, kind of going back to colonial times. And they're
Pinckney family. Wasn't that the detective agent? Oh, that's the Pinkertons. The Pinkertons. Never mind. I'm stupid. This pause never happened.
There's several Pinckneys. Most of them are named Charles. This is, I know you kind of have to, which Charles
true.
are you talking about?
You need a scorecard to keep track of the Pinckneys.
And if you look at the U.S. Constitution, there's 2 Charles Pinckneys that have signed for South Carolina, but this is Charles Coatsworth Pinckney. And he's the older gentleman of the 2 Charles Pinckneys that signed the Constitution. So he was actually not only a prominent local politician, but also rose to the rank of general during the Revolution.
So now, south of Fort Sumter is Fort Johnson. That does play a role in the firing on the fort. Can you talk about that?
Fort Johnson was the first fortified site outside of the city. It was founded in 1706. In fact, I say it's been under one government or another since 1706, so it's the longest government control piece of land probably in our whole area here. But once Fort Sumter was being built to the west of it, it kind of would turn Fort Johnson into a backwater, as well as Castle Pinckney, because now you're going to have the powerhouse of Fort Sumter working with the older but still adequate Fort Moultrie out at the harbor entrance. So the key is stop them at the harbor entrance. Don't let them get into the harbor before you start a fight. But Castle Pinckney and Fort Johnson, they were kept under Army control, thinking there would be a second string of defenses in case enemy ships did penetrate up into the upper harbor.
And one of the things that I really admire when I come out on the boat is seeing that Charleston skyline and all the church steeples that come up. How does that always strike you when you get the chance to see it?
Off the top of my head, I can't think of this, but anybody watching, if you know, was Charleston not attacked by water, by boat, I guess you could say? Was it attacked by land then? Because they couldn't come into the harbor, so they either went north or south and then unloaded troops and came up or down. I can't think of Charleston. I'm sure it was, but I can't think of, I'm thinking like Sherman probably attacked Charleston, but that could be wrong. If anyone knows.
Charleston's nickname is the Holy City for the number of historic church steeples that you see across our skyline. One thing we talked about a bit earlier was the Siege of Charleston, 1863 to 1865. And you have the Union Army out on Morris Island, and they're pretty much almost 4 miles from the city, but they're using these steeples as aiming points. So with all of the tons of steel that rained down on the city of Charleston, none of the historic steeples were toppled as a result of a direct hit from Union guns. So that's maybe divine intervention that none of our historic churches were very heavily damaged.
Anything else you'd want to mention as we continue across the harbor?
Yeah, we'll be coming up on Fort Johnson. This group of modern buildings over here is the site of Fort Johnson. And once we pass that, we'll be coming within cannon range of Fort Sumter. So this is where the first shot is going to be coming from. And it's going to be a signal shot. So they're going to fire, the Confederates over there are going to fire a mortar burst over the fort. So it's going to be like a star shot. And that would be the signal for all the other Confederate batteries on Sullivan's Island and Morris Island to open up on Fort Sumter. So imagine being out here at 4:30 in the morning, April 12th, 1861, and right at 4:30, you're going to hear a big boom come up from Fort Johnson. And that's going to really, that's the beginning of the Civil War right there. So all of the other, Morris Island will be second, Sullivan's Island will be third, and then after a while, they're all firing at Fort Sumter. Now this is 4:30 a.m. Fort Sumter will not return fire until almost 7 a.m. Oh. The fort's doing its job, protecting the men. So you're going to let the sun come up a little bit and, get a good sight on things, and then Fort Sumter will return fire.
I can only imagine how nerve-wracking that is to be taking fire and having to just take it without being able to protect yourself to fire back.
It is. Yeah, it must have been very frustrating, but it was no surprise to the men at Fort Sumter. They kind of knew it was coming because a Confederate delegation that visited Fort Sumter in the wee hours of that morning is kind of seeking a final ultimatum from the commander, Major Anderson, to give up the fort. And Major Anderson politely refused. And the Confederate delegation departed and quite frankly told him, we're going to fire on you before the sun comes up. Sure enough, at 4:30, their promise rang.
You can't say the South isn't polite and courteous. We're going to fire on you before the sun comes up. All right, thank you, appreciate it. Have a good day.
True. The first shot comes from Fort Johnson.
Very good.
So it was beginning of a very four-year bloody war ahead of us once he fired that first shot.
Sure. So for you who've been here as long as you have been, does it ever get old?
Not really, because every day is something new. It's you're gonna meet people from all over the world visiting Charleston and visiting Fort Sumter. So it's something different. It never really gets old. You can imagine in the summer it could be a bear when it's 98 degrees and the humidity's about the same.
Right.
But we get used to it.
Yeah. I mean, to me, it's such an iconic place, and it's like you said, people from all over the world come here because it's world renowned.
Sure.
That's a pretty big legacy to wrap your arms around.
It is, and it's the, of course, the Civil War began here, and that was definitely a game changer for our country. Like I say, it definitely reshaped the United States. Very different from what was before and what was after.
And of course, that has echoes around the world too.
Exactly, you're right.
I can't wait to come through and walk onto this historic ground. This is just going to be incredible.
That's great. If these old walls could speak, they'd have some very interesting stories to tell.
I bet. Wow. So Gary, we're standing outside of the fort and I can see a lot of different features, which seems to reflect a lot of different time periods. What are we looking at?
Sure. What you're seeing here with the brickwork, that's the bottom part of the old Pentagon shaped fort. We were built on top of a large submerged sandbar, about 3 acres in size, and ideally Mother Nature gave us a good place to build a fort, because on the other side of the ship channel is our older fort, Fort Moultrie on Sullivan's Island. Now the fort stands on a man-made foundation of 70,000 tons of New England granite. So I could say not England, New England, that means quarried in Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine, and moved down the coastline by water. And then they built this huge rock island, and then they're building the fort on top of that. What you're seeing here is part of the 6 million bricks that the Army purchased from area plantation brickyards. So every brick has its own story in that it was handmade by an enslaved person that worked on one of our area plantations that had a working brickyard.
Wow, handmade.
Yeah.
Wow. And this is only a fraction of the bricks that actually made up the fort. What did the fort originally look like?
That's right. This wall that you see here would have went up 50 feet. Once we go inside, we'll see where the buildings used to stand. Fortunately, all of the original living quarters were wiped out during the siege of Charleston. What you're seeing here, this is actually called the gorge wall, or the base of the Pentagon, or the back side. Now, since this side faced shallow water, you did not have first or second level gun rooms on this wall of the fort. On the other four sides of the Pentagon, you would have had two sets of arched gun rooms and then a flat top. So that means four sides of the fort would have had three levels of guns. Now, the fort was designed to mount 135 cannons and garrison 650 soldiers. Because of the coming of the Civil War, none of that ever happened. The fort was never fully fitted out as designed, and there were only 60 pieces of artillery here at the beginning. And as far as manpower, we're looking at just under 100. We know there were 85 men in the U.S. Army here and about 10 civilians that were associated with the federal government one way or another that cast their lot with Major Anderson, stayed here in the fort. So you've got about 95 souls inside the fort and about 2,000 Confederate soldiers on the islands around us. So not only are they outmanned drastically and outgunned, but they put up a good fight for 34 hours.
Now, you mentioned that it's a man-made foundation, and I know a lot of people think like, oh, how convenient. There's an island out in the middle of the harbor that they...
How many of you would have... I mean, if, let's say you had the choice, you could go back in time, and you can go to that fort, knowing what's going to happen. How many of you would do it if I told you you would live, right? You're going to live through the whole thing. But what you're going to experience could be hell on earth to you. Would you do it? If I knew 100% I would live, I would love to experience it. But if there was any potential risk where I could get a splinter, I am not doing it. 500, well, that was in the future. Not in the future. That was later on. That was a few years down the road, where he said 500 rounds were hitting it a day, but that was when the Union was bombarding it. But still, wow, it's terrifying.
Could put that fort on, but this island wasn't here once upon a time.
Correct. It was a shallow spot in the harbor, and if you were a good navigator, you knew to avoid it, but ships would run aground on it occasionally. In fact, during our Revolutionary War battle here, when the first Fort Moultrie was fighting 9 British warships, one of the British warships ran aground on top of the sandbar here and had to be lit afire by its crew, lest it get under come under control of the rebels or the patriots as we know them. So the site is very historic. It has a history going back to the Revolution. Like I said, it was easy. It wasn't easy, but it was less difficult for the Army to build on a shallow spot than in a deep spot. So say it was only about at low tide, about 10 feet underwater. So that and the fort built on top of it, and it has not settled at all. So that's good Army engineering over all the years.
So, now, one of the things that we can see from here is this flagpole, and there's a red stripe on the flagpole itself. What does that red...
Right. Now, the red stripe indicates the original height of the fort when it was 50 feet tall. That's 50 feet off of the water level where we're close to right here. So what the fort's actually missing is its upper 2 levels and the interior buildings. Now, the reason that just the bottom part of the old Pentagon fort remains today is, imagine the upper 2 levels shot full of holes from Union artillery on Morris Island right in back of us. And remember, they're hitting the place sometimes 500 times a day. They're pretty ferocious siege at different points. So after when the upper part of the fort started to collapse, it's fallen straight down and burying the bottom portion largely intact. So that means your whole bottom set of gun rooms got buried under all this rubble, largely intact. And that was actually better for the Confederates that are going to hang on to it, because the fort turned itself into an underground tunnel bunker system where the Confederates could still live underground during day when the place is under siege. And usually the Union would cease fire at nightfall. Then the Confederate soldiers would come out and work on reinforcing the wall, usually just by taking rubble and heaping it higher and higher, trying to maintain that defensive perimeter. Because once the Union started firing on it from Morris Island, that tall masonry wall was now a liability. So turning itself into a huge earthwork actually served the Confederates a little bit better for the duration that they hung on to the fort.
So one of the other structures that we can see from out here is this large black portion that
sir.
cuts across the middle of the fort. What's
Yes,
that?
sir. That's Battery Isaac Hugie. And that was built in the middle of the old fort starting in 1898. Finished it up a little over a year later. It was put in service around 1900. And it had 2 large 12-inch coastal defense rifles. So you think these are modern breech loaders. So kind of think of a small battleship type gun on shore. Sometimes folks refer to these batteries as concrete battleships.
We're going to go ahead and pause it right there on the concrete battleships, and we will be back for part 2. I know it's not even time, but who cares? All right, this has been, I find it interesting. I'm sure that a big chunk of my subscribers won't be watching it, but fascinating nonetheless. So until next time, for part 2, you have a good day, have a good night.